This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a bit cold and wet outside. It's cosy and warm in here, and we've got these beautiful side-by-side trees and people, which is going to be the theme of our lecture tonight. I'm Sarah Wilson. I'm head of the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, and it gives us great pleasure to have you with us all for our Brotherton lecture. And we're delighted to bring this to you. It's a special lecture because it's in collaboration with the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. So I'm sending a warm welcome to all of you, also on behalf of the head of school, Professor Ian Woodrow, who's here. Now, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, of the Kulin Nation, and also extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians here with us tonight. It's important, I think, to acknowledge that the land on which we meet was the place of age-old ceremonies, of celebration, of initiation and of renewal, and that the local Aboriginal people have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. And I think in contemplating the importance of place in the welcome to country, I think this is a really nice link to the theme of tonight's Brotherton lecture, which is all about the impact of our natural environment on our mental health and how we need to be exposed to nature, to spend time in nature in order to maintain it. It kind of goes way back in our roots. Now, we know we can learn a lot from our Indigenous colleagues about this and the importance of connection to country. But tonight what we're going to be doing is looking at this idea through the lens of modern science. And we're going to be taken on a wonderful journey of what there is to know, probably all there is to know about this, what is a relatively new and exciting scientific topic. It's a particularly important topic for us because it allows us to establish this collaboration with our colleagues in the natural sciences, and this is a new collaboration, and so it's one that we're also celebrating as part of this lecture. So to have the two schools come together this way is the first time at the university, and I think that's pretty special. So a little bit about the Brotherton lecture. It's a long-standing tradition in the school that we have this lecture. It's had many distinguished speakers over the years. It was established in honour of Dr. Patricia Leslie Brotherton. She was a lecturer in the school for many years and passed away in 1979. And she left a bequest which has now supported this ongoing lecture series. It usually happens on an annual basis, sometimes once every 2 years. This year it's been particularly special. We've had 2 esteemed Brotherton Fellows in the school. It's really good because they come and they spend time with us in the school, and it's a bit like an artist in residence program, but it's actually an esteemed academic residence program. So they come and they spend time in the school, they meet with more junior colleagues, they hear about the work and they share their wisdom and knowledge with us, and we learn great things. And this year we have had 2 esteemed fellows, as I mentioned. The first, for those of you who came to our lecture back in July, you will have heard the great talk by James Gross on managing your emotions. And this one tonight on a very different topic, that of exploring the benefits of experiencing nature for our health and mental well-being. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about Terry, Professor Terry Hartig, who is our guest Brotherton Fellow. He has an outstanding track record of accomplishments. He has extensive experience in studying this topic, and in particular restorative processes and the environments that support them. He really, if you think about him, he's built this field from the ground level up. He's been there from get-go. First in developing the theories that have guided thinking in the field, then in developing the methods and the research infrastructure to test those theories, and then taking the findings of his work out into the applied context in terms of residential living, workplace environments, institutions and recreational contexts. So to me, that's a really magnificent example, particularly for junior researchers amongst us, of how you really do basic science and you take it, follow it all the way through to the real world and let it have impact and shape what we do in the real world. Terry's best-known works in the research field look at restorative health benefits of nature, and here his work is unbelievably highly cited. So he has over 17,000 scientific citations of this work, and for those of you who are into metrics and science metrics, that's more than most of us might hope for in 3 lifetimes, perhaps. So he's an outstanding scholar, but I think equally importantly, he's been a real community citizen and very engaged in growing the discipline. He's had a long history of service to professional societies, the applied research community, journals, editorial boards, other collaborative activities. And he's supported the growth of those scientific societies. He's currently serving as president of the Environmental Psychology Division of the International Association for Applied Psychology, and he is a member of the Coordination Committee of the European Network for Housing Research. So again, that breadth of engagement. So what a fabulous career, and how lucky we are to have him with us tonight. Thank you for coming all this way. Please join me in welcoming Terry.
Can you hear me? There's hardly a better way to begin an evening than to meet with such a large group of curious people gathered together, interested in the things that I'm interested in, and wanting to do good things with the knowledge that they have. So I'm going to try to tell you something more about what I know. You can take some of that away with you. Perhaps that will help you in what you do, whether it's the way you live your life, the work that you do. Sarah, thank you for a very generous introduction. Sometimes as you were speaking, I was thinking, oh, it would be so nice if my mother and father could hear you. I'd also like to thank the hosts who have brought me here. Catherine Johnson from the School of Psychological Sciences, and Catherine Williams from the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. I'm very happy that the two of you could meet and work together and make it possible for me to join you in a collaboration, which also involves others here, Kate Lee, Nick Williams, and I'll tell you about some of the work that we've done when we go further on. The Brotherton lecture, it's quite an honor. And I wish I would have been able to talk with Patricia Brotherton, because I think we might have found some points of common interest. But we'll just believe that her spirit somehow is in this room, and in the spirit of her generosity, we'll go forward. But the first slide I have, the starting point for this presentation by way of setting context, is one that would seem to challenge generosity. we see a lot of challenges to generosity arising from the growth of population. So you can see here we're at this juncture. This is the latest population prospect from the UN. We're up around 8 million people. We started, where were we? 2 million in 1950. We're at the dashed line, ascending perpendicularly. 8 million people in 2019. And the projections are for additional billions of people. And we all know this in some way. We know this fact. And we can see what this kind of fact means for the environments around us. We can walk around in Melbourne. We can see the buildings going up. We understand in some way that this means more construction. People need housing. And in fact, it's not so bad here. Bad, I don't know, perhaps we shouldn't evaluate it. It's not so intense here as it is elsewhere. This population growth isn't evenly distributed across the globe. We understand that sub-Saharan Africa is going to see the greatest population growth. In Australia, the projections are for rather little in the grand scheme of things, some millions of additional people or tens of millions of additional people by the year 2100. But all of that assumes, of course, that people stay put. And that assumption is rather questionable. So there may be more people wanting to come here, wanting to come to Europe, wanting to come to North America from places that are not habitable any longer because of climate change. So we have a convergence of major trends that have major implications for our planet, planetary systems, and our living environments, and nature as our living environment. Now, the visions that many people have of this increasingly urban future, because this population is moving into cities, the image that we have is a rather dystopian one. Mega cities with horribly fouled air. Well, this is one way of looking at it, but it's not necessarily the most accurate vision. In 2016, the science magazine Science commissioned a special section on the urban planet. They're looking at trends in science, trends in population, trends in migration, trends in human impacts on the environment. And they're recognizing that we have to address the fact that we're an increasingly urban global population and that there are tremendous implications of this. Rapid urbanization is overtaxing the planet, but it may not have to. So they want to offer in this special section a more positive view of an urban future. I was invited to write a perspective piece for this special section. I invited a colleague, Peter Kahn, from the University of Washington, to join me in writing this piece, which I wanted to provoke a bit. I wanted a piece that would challenge the notion that cities are unnatural things and that life in cities is unnatural. Rather the opposite. I think we need to develop habits of speaking that acknowledge that cities are, as human constructions, efforts to create better habitat, in important respects, natural. At the same time, we understand that, like other species, humans can foul their habitat. We need to know what we need, then, in the way of good habitat. And this is a need that environmental psychology can help to fulfill. And this is the point that we make in this piece. we raise this question: how can psychological benefits from encounters with natural features and processes offset the psychological costs of other urban living conditions? The other there stands in red because I want to emphasize that the natural features are also part of an urban living condition. Answers to this question will help improve the quality of life of today's growing urban populations. This is our assertion, and this is our promise, in a sense. And there's a lot of work being done trying to understand these psychological benefits, trying to generate this psychological knowledge that can feed into design and planning and thinking about urban conditions. It's happening here in Melbourne. I mentioned my colleagues, Catherine and Kate and Nick and their colleagues in the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences and the School of Psychological Sciences, and many others. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the kind of work that we're doing and where it's going. In some ways, it's going to be quite basic, so my apologies to those of you who are already well acquainted with some of this. Sarah suggested I might tell you everything that there is to know, that I could, that we would have time for it. I'm afraid it's just going to be scratching the surface, but I'm sure we'll have time for discussions afterward, and perhaps some of those will continue amongst us for a long time to come. All right, basic concepts. Nature. Oh, what a frightening notion to try and define nature. I think it would be, well, it's beyond me to try and summarize the discussions we've had over millennia. What is nature? It can only suggest that we have very, very different ways of understanding it. And if you look in any dictionary, you find a definition of nature, you're going to see that there are a variety of meanings that are assigned to it, because there are so many aspects to it. So we can think of nature as cosmos, the all-encompassing. We're always in this nature. We are unavoidably part of this nature. We are specks. We are motes of dust. And then we have the nature that's always in us. This is something that's just coming into the discussion of nature and health, the microbiome. The implications that the gut microbiome and its health would have for mental health. But we can't ignore the fact that, in fact, at any given moment we are populated, our intestinal tracts are populated by 10, 20, 30, 50 species of different bacteria. And we need them to digest food. At this moment, they're working away. At this moment, they're populating our skin. So nature's in us. Nature's on us. We are in nature. And if we stop and think about this, this becomes part of our experience of nature. And that's the key thing here in the title of my lecture. I refer to nature experience, what people take to be nature. And typically they're not taking bacteria on their skin to be the key part of their nature experience. Perhaps they're thinking of the cosmos, but more commonly, they're thinking about a benign nature, a pleasant nature, not a nature that kills them, not a nature that kills people in huge numbers. I think 26 Australians died in the Boxing Day tsunami. The discussions of nature and health today also typically are not referring to how nature makes us sick. if I understand correctly, the Spanish flu epidemic was touching roughly a third of the world population. People didn't escape in one way or another. They knew somebody or they died from it themselves. The nature and health discussion is, in a sense, moving away from an ambivalence we've had in the health fields about how nature is harmful. It's trying to find a more positive view. And in that, we have this emphasis on different aspects of nature. And you could argue that there's more of an emphasis on nature as scenery, as what people look at and find aesthetically pleasing. Nature as a place to go into for recreation, for aesthetic experience, for self-realization. Here you have a picture of the Haslital, a home of alpine tourism. You had the intellectuals like Goethe, colleagues in that time, wandering around in these places, and they could write about their experiences. Being in relative safety, perhaps in some kind of farmhouse like this, and yet able to look at these terrifying mountains and appreciating the experience that they would have of awe, fear, delight. Now people can wander in these hills. The trail that you see there, I think, is part of a system of paths called the Romantic Way. You have wonderful climbing in the Engelhörner, these limestone spires in the background. But then you can come down from the Engelhörner and you can check into the Rosenlaui Hotel and have a delightful meal. It's wild, but not so wild it's going to leave you dead at the end of the day. And oftentimes when people are talking about nature experience, they're talking about this kind of setting and this kind of activity. They're talking about going for some restful activity in a relatively green place. This one happens to be in downtown London, but you can find others like this, very much like this in other major cities. Perhaps right outside here. If you look closely, you can see some heads here and there. People relaxing in the greenery here on the Melbourne campus. So in some ways, we've kept the nature that we want because we appreciate it as something that is beautiful, as restful, supportive of the realization of psychological benefits, and in particular, restorative benefits. Now, in studying nature experience and health, the relations that might be described as direct and those that might be mediated through processes like restoration, we now more and more see a representation of nature as green space, as data from satellite images. So you have a normalized difference vegetation index, and the availability of this index from satellite imagery has made possible a tremendous surge in epidemiological research. People have been able to relate data on green space near residences to geocodes, and those geocodes then can be linked with individual health data. And we have all of these cohort studies, these very large studies around the world that are linking up this satellite image green space data. It says nothing about what people do in these places. It says nothing about the meanings that people assign to them. But it's still, as a crude measure, helpful in understanding the potential implications of nature experience for health. I'll give you some examples later in my lecture. Health, like nature, a complex concept, multifaceted, and a concept that has changed in tandem with changes in notion of what causes ill health. as we made a movement toward non-communicable or lifestyle diseases as major causes of death and illness, then we've appreciated that we needed a concept of health that was more multifaceted, that paid attention to what people did, their behavior, that paid attention to genetics, sources of vulnerability, that paid attention to social factors and so forth. And also the recognition that we needed to move away from a definition of health framed simply in terms of an absence of disease. Definition of health that emphasized the positive aspects, people having good health. And that's what we see widely referred to in the literature on nature and health. Health is a condition in which someone or something is thriving or doing well, well-being. Now, how might nature come to affect health? Well, there are many ways. I'm not going to try to summarize them for you, but what I can do is give you this representation. This is a representation that came out of a workshop, an expert workshop held in Munich a few years ago. This is published in the journal Environmental Research. And we describe different domains of pathways, ways in which the natural environment, nature, green space, could come to affect health. So, for example, some pathways may involve mitigation, that is, reducing harm. So if you have green space, say some forest close to your home, that may serve to buffer your home from exposure to sound, unwanted sound, noise from a freeway, for example, or particulate matter, air pollution, or heat, may provide shade. We also have a set of pathways, a domain of pathways we can refer to as instaurative. They serve instauration, the building of capacities. So, green space, nature, a setting for physical activity, for example, in the neighborhood. People are attracted out by green space, they're more physically active, and in the long term that may support health. Or they're attracted out and they meet their neighbors, and that builds community, and that over the long run serves health. And then we have a pathway, or rather a domain of pathways involving restoration. If you're building capacities, some of those capacities can become depleted as we meet the demands of everyday life. They may need restoration, and people commonly are going to natural environments, to nature, to green space for restoration. This is something that we have seen in motive studies of outdoor recreation across many, many years, going back into the 1950s. People go to get away from stressful circumstances. They go to nature. Now, I'm going to emphasize this restoration pathway and what I have to say going forward here. Restoration I define as a rubric covering processes through which people renew physical, psychological, and/or social resources or capabilities diminished in ongoing efforts to meet adaptive demands. So I emphasize processes. There are multiple processes. We have multiple resources that we use in meeting the demands of everyday life. These can become depleted, and we may have particular processes of restoration for specific resources, or that serve multiple resources. This is a set of questions for our research. I refer to people here, not just individuals, as you might expect of a psychologist, because we appreciate that some of the resources that get depleted in everyday life are held in common between people. We talk about relational resources. What holds two people together? Perhaps in meeting the demands of everyday life, a hectic working life, people don't have enough time for a partner, children, whatnot. Relations can become weaker. Less commitment to help, less willingness to help. What can be done to renew those resources? That kind of restoration also can be situated in nature. I have to be careful. I don't want to equate nature with the restorative environment. But in fact, much of the research on restorative environments has focused on nature. But in fact, many different places can support processes of psychological, social restoration. I define a restorative environment as an environment that promotes and not only permits restoration. I want to emphasize that it's not just a matter of taking away things that are stressful and demanding. It's also a matter of there being something in that environment that keeps people there. They want to go there, and when they go there, it's not just that they're leaving these things behind, but it's easier for them to stop thinking about them. There's something that engages them in that place. Now, when I talk about restoration, restorative environments, I want to emphasize I'm talking about things that are quite ordinary, quite normal. Restoration is a process that happens with all of us regularly. It's not just a matter of overcoming trauma, not just a matter of recovering from disease. Though ordinary restoration can support these kinds of recovery processes, recovery from trauma, illness, and so forth. And similarly, restorative environments need not be extraordinary environments. They can be quite mundane. It can be just that little bit of garden that somebody arranges out behind their house. It can be a potted plant that someone brings into the office to enhance its restorative quality because it, for them, represents nature and allows them to go off into an experience of nature. When we talk about theories with regard to nature experience and how it serves restoration, we have a conventional narrative, the two theories narrative, a narrative that refers to different things or states, if you will, that people can restore from, and then that proposes different processes leading to different outcomes. So we have attention restoration theory, proposed by Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, the University of Michigan, that emphasizes directed attention fatigue as what we can restore from. That is, fatigue of this ability to willfully direct our attention to things that may not be interesting of themselves. This is a capacity that we regularly use in our modern lifestyles. We have to do things that we don't find particularly interesting. We have to inhibit other things that could be more interesting. We need to maintain a focus. That takes effort. That capacity to direct attention can become depleted. And the argument by this theory, then, is that to restore this capacity to direct attention, people must get away from what is demanding, get away from what they usually are thinking about, get away to a place that engages attention without effort. So being away is what is permitting restoration. Fascination is what is promoting restoration. Fascination that is sustained if the place has greater extent. Fascination that is sustained if their presence there, their continuing presence in that environment, is compatible with what they want to do and must do. Now that's a cognitive theory about restoration, focused on a cognitive resource, directed attention capacity. It contrasts with what we can refer to as stress reduction or stress recovery theory, which has been proposed by Roger Ulrich, which emphasizes how people recover from psychophysiological stress. So somebody perhaps has an angry encounter at work, or they have to run for the bus, or they have to get out of the way of the bus very quickly. These moments of acute stress in everyday life, we can more quickly and completely recover from them in terms of how we feel, in terms of our physiology, if we have the possibility to distance ourselves from the threat and then engage with visual contents. We look at a scene that evokes a positive emotional response. And Roger Ulrich argues that this positive emotional response is biologically prepared in the case of vegetation and other features of nature, that we are, through evolution, biologically prepared to respond rapidly and positively to some environmental configurations that now we call natural. And that when that positive response is evoked, it blocks negative thoughts and negative feelings and allows for deactivation physiologically. And then we are prepared for the next demands that come along. We can mobilize again. And then you have some other characteristics of the visual stimulus array that could play in restoration. So you have a scene in front of you. This is really an emphasis on visual experience of the environment, a scene that has moderate depth and moderate complexity. There's enough to keep a person looking. So you have these two theories, and they've informed and guided much research. I'm going to tell you about some of that research. I'm going to begin with the experimental research because that's the earliest, if you will. And that experimental research became particularly important later when there was enough of it to convince epidemiologists that we understand that there are plausible mechanisms through which nature experience over the long run could have implications for important health outcomes. So we're going to move from small-scale experiments to very large studies of an epidemiological kind. So these experiments have to do with basic processes. Experiments that compare short-term effects of natural versus urban settings. And here there's really an opposition created. Despite what I said earlier about having to overcome this opposition, this, in fact, has been an important contrast in this experimental literature. Experiments that compare short-term effects of natural versus urban settings have advanced our understanding of the underlying psychological processes and relevant environmental features. We talk about a natural versus urban comparison, but in fact, we're talking about a very limited set of urban settings. And in fact, these experiments were set up to address the kind of urban environment we didn't want to have more of. So this is an experiment I'll tell you about carried out in Southern California, where we were observing growing population, observing expanding urban sprawl. Expanding urban sprawl predicated on the use of automobiles. So in fact, oftentimes these urban comparison conditions are outdoor urban transportation settings that we compare to parks. Now in this particular study, about 100 university students went out to either Santiago Oaks Regional Park in Orange County, California, south of Los Angeles, or they went to Santa Ana. There was a field lab set up at each place. They went through a long series of tasks that imposed heavy demands on their ability to direct attention, and then they went for a walk for about 50 minutes, either in this area in Santa Ana, walking along the streets here with the traffic, or in Santiago Oaks Regional Park. Where would you rather walk? And then they came back, and after they came back, they did a proofreading task. We thought, here's a task that people have to perform in their ordinary lives, quite commonly. They have to go through texts and make corrections. So we gave these subjects standardized texts. We planted very simple errors in these texts, and we wanted to see, will these subjects be able to detect more of these errors if they have walked in the park? And you can see some of the errors there. They're quite simple. It doesn't require a lot of intelligence. It doesn't require a lot of experience reading. It requires that they attend to what they're reading, that they're reading with care, looking for errors. That's what they've been instructed to do. And what we find is that proofreading performance, the percentage of errors detected, was greater among those who walked in the park. They detected about, 53, 55%? And those in the urban outdoor condition and those in a passive relaxation condition were also detecting quite many. None of them were detecting all of the errors. The task was hard enough. But there was a statistically reliable increase or relative advantage in performance among those who walked in the park. Now, you might think this is a pretty unremarkable difference, and by some standards, yes. But then think about what errors can mean for people and organizations. Small errors can cost individuals and organizations pain and suffering. So we want to take care to provide help for people, provide support for people, that they can do things correctly in their work. So it's a meaningful outcome. At the same time, it's an outcome that from a psychologist's perspective is problematic. What actually is the capacity being restored here? Is this really a measure of directed attention capacity? What is going on here? Perhaps this is a measure of the ability to proofread, and we have systematic variation that we didn't know about in the distribution of proofreading skills. I don't think so, but we're left wondering. So we have had a progression in experimental research since then. I don't know if you can read that in the far back there, but here you have a timeline. This is a timeline given in a meta-analysis published last year by a group in Copenhagen. They went into the literature, they identified experimental studies that measured cognitive effects. They're looking particularly for effects on directed attention capacity, documented in experiments that had particular design criteria. So they're looking for good quality studies that get at what is it that's being restored? What cognitive capability? Now you see one study circled in red there. That was the experiment I just presented for you. You can see that there's a dashed line rising perpendicularly. That represents the year in which an earlier meta-analysis was done, published in 2016. So you can appreciate that within a matter of a few years after that first meta-analysis, there was a rush of new and better experiments coming out. And what did they find? Well, their meta-analysis of effect estimates from multiple experiments found results in line with attention restoration theory, but for only a few of the measures that have been used, such as the trail making test, version B, which they interpret as a measure of cognitive flexibility or attentional control. Attentional control needed to switch back and forth between two sets of rules. Now, that sounds abstract, so let's consider an example here. Here you have one set of rules. You are to draw a line from 1, you see it circled, from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and so on. And your time is being taken. How long does it take you to complete the trail? That's TMT, or Trail Making Test version A. Here you have version B. Now you have to draw your line from 1 to A. From A to 2. From 2 to B. Y'all with me? Are you all in this experience of doing the trail making test version B? You can appreciate that you're slowing down as you have to do this, as you have to switch back and forth between the different sets of rules. And that's the point of the task. The difference in the time it takes you to complete version B compared to version A is a switching cost, the cost you pay of having to juggle the additional set of rules. And if you're attentionally fatigued, the thinking is you're going to have a longer time required to complete version B. So they meta-analyzed data from a set of experiments, and this is what they found. You see the black diamond at the bottom, and that indicates that you have, looking across a number of experiments, an aggregate effect in favor of a natural comparison environment. That those people who have walked in or looked at a natural environment in an experiment have performed better on the trail-making bee task than those people who have been randomly assigned to some other comparison condition, typically some form of urban representation. So this is where we are now. We're narrowing in our psychological experimentation on the cognitive mechanisms that could account for this particular form of restoration. Now that's just one set of studies. I'm not going to go into the literature, the experimental literature on the stress reduction theory. We just don't have time for it because I need to go on and talk about other kinds of evidence that we have. And these also that are building on attention restoration theory, just for continuity. Intervention studies are demonstrating how restorative experiences in natural settings can be used in caring for people who are suffering from physical and mental health problems. Now, these may be people who are presenting with clinically significant problems, or these may be people who are simply struggling with everyday life. They experience that they themselves have stress and attentional problems, even if they're not getting help from a professional. I'll give you examples of each. One is a therapeutic horticulture program. The context for this study is interesting. This is a small farm on the outskirts of Oslo. Now, it used to be a productive farm. It's an old farm. But they cannot participate in an agricultural economy in the same way anymore. They don't have the scale. So you have all of these small farmers who are looking for other things to do. They can maintain their farms. Well, in a sense, then, they're farming mental health. They're inviting people to come in. So this is a therapeutic horticulture program that's designed by a clinician, but is run by a farmer. People who are referred with clinical depression are coming to the farm twice a week, 3 hours each time. They're meeting in a small group, and they do this through a 12-week period. So they're going from the spring, the germination of plants, into the fall and flowering and harvesting. Now, it's not simply nature. It's not as though they're going into something that they consider to be nature, and that's the only active component here. Bear in mind that they're being encouraged to get out of bed and go somewhere, that kind of activation. They're meeting other people. There's a social component. So it's difficult to tease out what exactly is working here. And in this particular study I'm going to tell you about, there are only 18 people. There's no comparison condition. It's a very weak design. But sometimes this is all that can be done to get at some of the questions that we have. It's difficult to recruit people, simply. But what was done in this study was to measure severity of depression repeatedly from before the intervention to the start of the intervention, and then at 4-week intervals, so that we could follow a progression. We see that it's not declining. Depression severity is not declining to any great degree from recruitment to the start. Then it declines fairly substantially from the start to 4 weeks, and then it continues declining, though only slightly. So we have a pattern of change that maps onto participation in the intervention, participation in therapeutic horticulture. But importantly here, we also have a measure of their experience of fascination. How interesting and engaging do they find this activity to be, this therapeutic horticulture? And so they've completed a measure, a self-report measure of fascination, how interesting they find this to be. You have a value there. It's on a 10-point scale, so they're quite high values, measured at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 12 weeks. And you can see that they're not changing appreciably. So it's not as though as people come out of depression, they're more positive about things generally and find the place more interesting. It's a fairly stable level. And importantly, it's also correlated with the degree of change that is observed in depression severity. So to the extent people report that their symptoms of depression are becoming milder, they also have reported that they found the activity more fascinating. And why might this be the case? Well, the argument here is that when they can do this activity, this therapeutic horticulture activity, it breaks into a cycle of rumination. People suffering from depression are often ruminating in a maladaptive way, problematic things that they can't solve. Some rumination might be adaptive. People think about a problem, they can solve it. But maladaptive rumination is identified as one of these processes that can feed into depression and lead depression to persist. So here's something that might break into that. Well, I come from Uppsala University. Carl von Linné is one of our famous professors. It's an old university. It's established 1477. I'm told that previously, when professors had arguments, they sometimes settled them with swords. Just a thought, he and Sarah. Well, Carl von Linné, I think many people know as a botanist, Linnaeus. But he, in fact, was installed as a professor of medicine. And he wrote a kind of self-help book called De Dieta Naturalis. And those of you who are speaking Latin can certainly correct my pronunciation. Well, Linné had these rules for living. It's a lifestyle book. Number 64. Djupa spekulationer som anstränger hjärnan skall du underlätta. He actually is referring to something that we now could frame as rumination. Deep speculations that strain the brain you should avoid. Ett lugnt sinne förlänger livet, ett sorgset förkortar det märkbart. That is, a calm demeanor will extend life. A sad one will shorten it remarkably, notably. And then this last one. Läkekonst utan diet gör föga nytta. En dåra är den som sätter sin lit till medicin om dieten har förmåga att hjälpa. Medicine without lifestyle does little good. It is a fool, a crazy person, Dora, who trusts only in medicine if lifestyle can help. Now, we are getting a lot of guidance about how we can bring nature into our lifestyle to support health. We're also getting a lot of guidance about how we can learn skills like mindfulness to help us better manage stress, promote health over the long run. Well, what if we bring these things together? Just a few weeks ago, a PhD student that I have been supervising, Freddie Lemaeus, successfully defended his doctoral dissertation, and it was just on this topic, bringing mindfulness meditation and the natural environment together. Now, at Uppsala, we have botanical gardens. Just outside the Department of Psychology, we have a tropical greenhouse. And it was possible for Freddie to lead courses in mindfulness meditation in this greenhouse. And he developed a 5-week course in which the exercises were outward oriented. They're built on the idea that you take these people who are presenting with stress and attention problems, and you don't try to teach them something that of itself can be quite effortful, controlling their attention in meditation. Rather, you let them be in that place and let their attention go out to what is in the tropical greenhouse. So he contrasted that with a conventional mindfulness course, parallel in many respects, offered in classrooms indoors, fairly typical setting. And what he found was that the course with the outward-oriented exercises, restoration skills training is what he has called it, promoted experiences of being away and fascination during the meditation practice, that this in turn promoted state mindfulness in the exercises, in the practice, and that this in turn promoted greater compliance. Significantly fewer people dropped out. Now that's important. Think again, people who are encouraged to learn meditation skills to handle their stress. But they're so stressed they can't take on something new. And a mindfulness meditation course of the conventional type can be quite demanding. They may simply not be able to stay with it. So in fact, 27% dropout from a conventional course is fairly typical, according to the literature. So what Freddie found, it's not a tiny sample here for this kind of study, is that when you lean on the environment, so to say, you design mindfulness exercises that are suited to the environment, outward-oriented, you promote compliance. I think my time is drawing short here, but I do have some more evidence to share with you, so please bear with me. I want to talk about public health applications, and in particular epidemiological evidence. Large-scale epidemiological studies are documenting relationships between access or proximity to green space, typically as measured with this satellite data, represented as NDVI, and health outcomes that may reflect on the cumulative effect of many restorative experiences over time. If you go into the web of science, as I did earlier today, you'll find that there's been a boom in research, and a lot of that has been fueled by groups in environmental epidemiology around the world who are linking the NDVI data with national health surveys and other kinds of health data in large studies. So here you have, as of today, 570 new articles published in journals that are listed in the Web of Science, which have gone through some kind of quality control before listing. And already we've exceeded what we had last year, and this is the trend. Now, in some absolute sense, it's not a great number. It's far fewer, for example, than the number of papers dedicated to infectious illnesses, the ways that nature kills us. But still, we see this dramatic trend. We can wonder if this is mapping well onto a trend in population and urbanization. Now, an early study in this series was carried out in the Netherlands. They linked green space data to people's residence. These are people who had completed a national health survey. There are more than 250,000 of them. They're reported on their health. And these researchers are able to show that there is an association between the amount of green space within a 3-kilometer radius of the residence and self-reported health. So as there is more green space, the percentage of people reporting their health less than good is going down. Now, as with the experimental study, it's not a very strong effect. But when we think of the number of people affected over long periods of time, we come to this classic public health concern. Small improvements in the environment can have profound implications for the health of the population. There are, of course, studies underway in Australia, and some of them are not looking directly at restoration. Many of them are looking at physical activity. Here you have reference to a study by colleagues of ours who are active at the University of Wollongong and University of New South Wales, Thomas Astelbert and Shaoqi Feng. We just had a meeting with them. They're lovely people. And here they're focusing on physical activity. Green space is associated with walking and moderate to vigorous physical activity in middle to older aged adults, findings from 203,883 Australians. And they say what this study adds. The study adds novel understanding of the extent that living in greener neighborhoods promotes not only weekly participation, but also more frequent sessions of walking and moderate to vigorous physical activities. And this is all very good. And there are other studies like this. But I want to bring it back to restoration. I want to emphasize that physical activity, its capacity building, is also related to the kind of nature experience that supports restoration. Typically, people aren't going out to natural places for exercise with the thought that I'm going to be 35% less likely to die in 24 years. My sense of this is that people go out to these places for physical activity and to have a pleasant experience. And oftentimes that pleasant experience is one of restoration. They've had a tough day, they take a walk in the park near the home, and they wind down. Restoration and physical activity are bound up. Physical activity carries a psychological process, and that process oftentimes will be restoration. I think this is the last data that I'll tell you about here. This is a fairly new study. It was reported in March, Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, by a Danish group. They calculated the amount of green space around the residence for children from birth through 10 years of age. So they had a value, green space value, NDVI, for each year of the first 10 years. And then they looked to see if that value was predictive of them presenting to a medical professional with some form of psychiatric disorder later in life. Doesn't matter that children have green space. Doesn't mean that they're going to have better mental health in the long run. This was the concern. This is perhaps not such a friendly image. Can you read that in the back? Okay, you can appreciate that here we have a long list of disorders. And the dots represent estimates. Dots to the right of the dashed line indicate a higher risk of developing a given psychiatric disorder for children living in the lowest compared to the highest amount of green space. And you can see that some of them, like schizoaffective disorder, see if this works here. Well, you have the confidence intervals, the error bands, crossing the dashed line. That means that they're not statistically reliable. It doesn't appear that green space is so profoundly important for that form of psychiatric disorder. But for neurotic stress-related and somatic disorders, those that we might expect to be particularly sensitive to having had possibilities for restoration, even as a child, show that there's a substantially increased risk if there's little green space around the home as a child. Here we have a prospective study, sophisticated analytic methods, hard outcome measure, people presenting with psychiatric disorders, a very crude measure of nature experience, and yet we can see these kinds of associations. There's a lot of discussion of this in Denmark now. How do we want our children to have it? It's not only in Denmark. So the World Health Organization and other international bodies are getting engaged. You can go on the internet and get this kind of review of the epidemiological and other research. A lot of this is widely available. And a lot of this is getting applied. Applied in urban design, applied by people like my colleagues here, who are engaged with the search for places in which we can introduce features of nature, processes of nature. We have a green infrastructure group at this university. It involves ecologists and psychologists. Psychologists helping them to develop and apply this kind of knowledge that can make for better living conditions. Both enthusiasm and restraint are needed as we work to document and understand relations between nature experience and health. I often find people so enthusiastic. Nature's good for you. Nature's good for you. And I have to think, what version of nature are you talking about? Not the version of nature that kills you or makes you sick. And those versions are out there, and we need to respect those. enthusiasm and restraint. Progress is being made in building the scientific base of evidence on restoration as a pathway or domain of pathways between nature, experience, and health. But many questions remain. Now, this is a figure, this is a new, relatively new scientific product by Catherine Williams, Catherine Johnson, Kate Lee, Nick Williams, myself, and Lisa Sargent, published last year in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. And what we're trying to do here is to show how multiple psychological processes can be bound up and running together within nature experience. So, for example, a restorative process may be underway, and a creative process may be underway. And the restorative process may support a creative process. It's a rather complicated image, and perhaps you're feeling a bit attentionally fatigued yourselves. Sometimes we use the word horrendogram. But this is something that is the result of careful discussion, how as people spend time in a natural environment, the orientation of their attention may shift from the outward toward the nature around them to the inward, their own thoughts, experiences, ideas that they've brought with them to this place. And over time, this alternation between soft fascination and mind wandering can support both attention restoration and the generation of new ideas, and then afterwards, a restored person has a better ability to evaluate those ideas. So here we're moving into new territory. These are just some of the many questions that we will have to work with going forward. Research will proceed against a background of change in the environment, how we experience nature, and how we think about our place in it. This is what I'd like to leave you with. And here we are all together. We're interested in this topic. Many of us care deeply about what is happening in the environment. We want to take what we know to work for positive environmental change. As we are doing that, here now, together, we are thinking about how we conceive of nature, the nature we've had, the nature we have now, the nature we could have, how that fits in our living environments, how we fit in nature. And that's all of it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.